They never noticed her until it was too late. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, scattering light across gowns worth small fortunes and tuxedos stitched in Paris. The gala was supposed to be a night of triumph for others, a celebration of power and wealth, a stage where her presence was meant to be nothing more than a footnote. Yet in that glittering room filled with applause, whispers, and half-smiles, she was about to become the only story anyone would remember. For years, Eleanor Grace had perfected the art of vanishing, not literally, but socially disappearing from the circles that once whispered her name with admiration and envy. She had been the forgotten figure, the ex-wife who had supposedly faded into obscurity after her husband's very public betrayal. People thought they knew her. They thought she had fallen into silence, broken and bitter. They thought wrong. What they didn't know was that in her silence, she was building. Every day away from the spotlight had been a step in a long, deliberate climb back to the summit. The invitation had arrived like an echo from another life. Thick cardstock, edges pressed in gold. The name of the Metropolitan Gala inscribed in bold serif letters. For 15 years, she had walked those very halls beside her husband, smiling at photographers, guiding committees, curating menus and music. But this time her name was not on any program. She was not a host. She was not even expected to attend. It was, perhaps, an afterthought or perhaps a challenge, a reminder of her exile. To the world it looked like an invitation. To Eleanor, it felt like a summons. She had almost laughed when she read it. Almost. Because beneath the amusement was something far more dangerous resolve. It had been years since she signed the papers that erased her from Preston Hale's empire. Years since she walked away with the fragments of a life dismantled in front of the cameras. But the world did not know what she carried with her when she left. They did not know about the long nights in her small apartment, textbooks scattered across her bed like fallen leaves, spreadsheets glowing on her laptop at 3 in the morning. They did not know that she had turned her grief into discipline, her heartbreak into fuel, her invisibility into armor. The night of the gala, as Eleanor stood before her mirror, she did not see the woman they had discarded. She did not see the soft figure of a wife molded by expectation. She saw the reflection of a strategist, a woman who had clawed her way out of shadows and into something unshakable. The dress she wore was simple, no sequins, no feathers, no attempt to compete with the glitz of the crowd. Midnight silk fell in clean lines, commanding attention not through extravagance but through elegance. Her hair was swept into a knot that revealed the line of her neck, a quiet signal of confidence. On her wrist was no diamond cuff, only a sleek watch whose face flickered with data, numbers alive with secrets. Inside her clutch was no ornament. It held no perfume bottle, no trinket to impress. Tucked away within was the culmination of 5 years of relentless effort, the blueprint of an empire no one knew existed, one she had built brick by unseen brick, trade by trade, decision by decision. They thought she had lived on settlements, that she had shrunk into obscurity. In truth, she had risen higher than they could have ever imagined. When she entered the ballroom, silence did not fall immediately. Why would it? To them, she was a ghost. But ghosts have a way of stealing the air. Heads began to turn. Conversations faltered. Some recognized her, some barely remembered. Others whispered her name like an old scandal. Yet the ones who stared hardest were those who had once looked at her with pity. Their eyes narrowed as if trying to reconcile the woman before them with the memory of the one they had dismissed. She wasn't fragile anymore. She wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. She carried herself like someone who no longer needed validation. Preston was already there, laughing loudly, his hand resting on the back of his new wife's chair. The photographers adored him, as they always did. He basked in their attention, sure that he had erased Eleanor from the narrative of his triumph. But when his eyes found her across the room, the glass in his hand trembled slightly. She saw it, and she smiled, not the smile of longing, not of pain, but of certainty. It was not revenge she carried with her into that room. It was proof that the story others had written for her was unfinished, that she was more than the discarded ex-wife of a wealthy man. She was no longer the shadow in his empire. She was the empire itself. The night would not belong to Preston. It would not belong to the woman who had replaced her at his side. The night would belong to Eleanor Grace, and by the time the music stopped, No one would ever look down on her again. The orchestra swelled as if to announce her arrival. The moment she stepped further into the light, people leaned closer, whispering as though she carried a secret too large to keep hidden. And perhaps she did, because in her eyes burned something the Gala had not seen in years: unapologetic brilliance. It was not wealth alone, not beauty alone, but the undeniable glow of someone who had lost everything and still managed to win. The predators in the room, the men who built fortunes by crushing rivals, the women who thrived on scandal and social ladders. They did not yet realize what stood before them. They believed she was a ghost from the past, but tonight they would learn the truth. Ghosts are not powerless. Sometimes they are the most dangerous presence in the room. The music faded into the hum of conversation, glasses clinking in rehearsed rhythm. Eleanor moved slowly through the crowd, every step measured, deliberate. Her gaze calm, as if she had walked these halls not as a guest but as their owner. People parted without realizing it, instinctively making way for her. They couldn't explain why their attention shifted, but they felt the gravity of her presence, as though something unseen pulled their eyes toward her. She didn't rush to claim the spotlight. She let it find her, and in a room filled with people desperate to be noticed, that made her unforgettable. She reached the edge of the grand staircase, pausing to take in the room below. From here she could see them all: investors, politicians, heirs, and socialites, each cloaked in confidence, each convinced of their place in the world. Years ago, she had stood among them as Preston's wife, introduced as though her worth was defined by the man beside her. Tonight, she stood alone, yet somehow taller, as though the absence of his shadow had allowed her to grow. Her gaze swept the tables, pausing briefly on Preston. He laughed a little too quickly, a little too loudly, like a man determined to keep attention fixed on himself. Bianca, the new wife, shimmered in her seat, radiant in a gown designed to dazzle. Her smile was polished, her jewels perfectly chosen, yet there was a sharpness behind her eyes. Eleanor recognized it at once: the anxious awareness of someone who knows her throne is borrowed, not built. The whispers began to thicken. A man at one table leaned toward his companion. "Isn't that Eleanor Grace? I thought she disappeared." Another murmured, "Strange she would show up here, of all places." And then the one Eleanor had been waiting for. "She looks different, stronger." The comment spread like a spark. The same people who once dismissed her as fragile now tilted their heads, searching for signs of transformation. They couldn't place it. Was it the dress, the posture, the steady light in her eyes? They didn't know the truth, that what they saw was not the result of one night of preparation, but of 5 relentless years. Years where she traded society columns for late-night study sessions, dinner parties for investment reports, and luxury boutiques for rooms where she sat quietly among people who underestimated her. Every night had been a rehearsal for this moment. She descended the staircase, each step as silent as a secret, and reached the floor just as the first speaker took the stage. A hush settled over the crowd as the lights dimmed, a spotlight catching Preston as he rose to address the room. His voice carried easily, smooth and practiced. He spoke of art, philanthropy, the importance of legacy. It was a speech Eleanor had heard before, almost word for word, when she had helped him write it years ago. He had not changed. He had only recycled. And the crowd, blind to repetition, applauded as though it were profound. But Preston's confidence faltered when his eyes drifted toward her. For the briefest second, his voice wavered, a small crack in the armor. He recovered quickly, smoothing over the pause with a smile. Yet Eleanor saw it. She knew him too well, knew the exact look he wore when he felt the ground shift beneath him. He would never admit it, not in front of this audience. But the tremor in his chest had already begun. She did not rush to make her presence known. Instead, she let him stew in uncertainty, let him wonder why she was here, what she carried with her. Was it bitterness? Was it a public outburst? Was it scandal? Preston was a man who thrived on control, who built empires by anticipating every move before it happened. But Eleanor was now unreadable, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. As the applause filled the hall, Eleanor slipped quietly into a seat near the front, her eyes fixed on the stage. Around her, conversations buzzed again, but now her name floated more frequently, like a thread stitching through every corner of the room. She could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing against her as she let it build, because suspense was as powerful as revelation. A waiter stopped beside her, offering champagne. She accepted, lifting the glass with a hand as steady as stone. The bubbles rose to the surface, delicate and fleeting, like the illusions of wealth and power that surrounded her. She thought of the nights when her only company had been the glow of her computer screen, when she had stared down numbers until her eyes blurred. Those nights had built this moment. They had built her, and now she sat in a room that once pitied her, knowing that by the end of the night, pity would be replaced by awe. The first auction of the evening began. Paintings, sculptures, pieces of history that whispered of power. Eleanor listened as the bids rose, each voice trying to outdo the last. Each paddle raised with a subtle flourish. To most, it was a game of wealth. To her, it was an opportunity, not to flaunt money, but to demonstrate something far greater. She waited, measured, as the numbers climbed higher and higher, until the crowd's energy thickened with competition. Then, calmly, she raised her hand. The room stilled. Her bid was not just high, it was final, a number no one else dared to challenge. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a decisive crack. The art was hers, but more importantly, so was the silence that followed, the silence that carried awe, shock, and the first stirrings of respect. Across the room, Preston shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, his laughter muted. Bianca leaned in, whispering, her perfect smile flickering at the edges. Eleanor didn't need to hear the words to know what was said. Who is she now? Where did she get this power? She took a sip of champagne, her lips curving into a faint smile. Let them wonder. Let them whisper. The night was far from over, and she had only just begun to reveal what she had become. Because the truth was simple. They thought she came here to watch. They thought she was an echo of the past. But Eleanor Grace had come to take back her place, not beside anyone, not beneath anyone, but above, where she had built herself to belong. And as the orchestra swelled again, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning with a light no one could ignore. Tonight, the story was hers, and before the night ended, the world would know it. The applause faded, but the silence that lingered after her bid was louder than any ovation. People shifted in their seats, pretending to turn back to their conversations, yet every glance found its way back to her. Eleanor could feel the weight of their stares, the way curiosity clung to her like static in the air. But she didn't flinch. She let it stay. Curiosity was power, and she had spent too many years learning how to let it work in her favor. Preston's eyes never left her, though his lips curved in a smile meant for the cameras. His grip on his glass betrayed him. The man who once prided himself on anticipating every move now sat unsettled, his composure cracking at the edges. It wasn't the money that unsettled him, he had plenty of it, it was the certainty with which Eleanor had acted. No hesitation, no second glance, no sign of calculation. Just the kind of confidence only someone with unshakable ground beneath them could project. What no one in that room knew was that this confidence had been forged in nights no one had seen. The world assumed Eleanor's life after her divorce had been one of quiet decline, that she lived off settlements and faded memories. But the truth was very different. While Preston had been building towers in the skyline, Eleanor had been constructing something less visible but far more powerful. She remembered the first months after walking away, when the noise of scandal was still fresh and every article seemed to dissect her life. She had rented a small brownstone in a neighborhood where no one cared about the name Hale, a place where she could walk unrecognized. At night, she sat by the window with nothing but a desk lamp, teaching herself the language of markets and strategy. Numbers became her escape, her battlefield, her map to a world where reputation didn't matter, only precision. She started small, a few trades here and there, just enough to learn. Every mistake became a lesson. Every loss a reminder that resilience wasn't something you were given, it was something you built. She watched patterns, studied trends, memorized the ways the powerful moved money like pawns on a chessboard. Slowly, steadily, she grew sharper, quicker, bolder. What had once been a mystery became second nature. By the second year, she was no longer playing small. She had formed a private fund, hidden behind shell companies, faceless to anyone trying to trace it. Investors who would have laughed at her name unknowingly backed her ventures, their signatures giving life to the empire she was building in silence. While Preston sought headlines, she sought results. While he paraded acquisitions, she quietly built foundations. And then came the turning point, a single decision that changed everything. It was a deal others had overlooked, a company discarded as irrelevant in a world chasing flashier trends. Eleanor had seen what others missed. She invested, not recklessly but with conviction, and when the world finally caught on, her position was unshakable. Overnight, she had gone from careful trader to silent powerhouse. No one outside her circle knew her name, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Now, sitting in that glittering ballroom, she felt the weight of those years pressing against her like armor. Every late night, every failure turned into lesson, every calculated risk, it had all led here. The champagne in her hand wasn't just a drink. It was a reminder of how far she had come from the nights when she had counted pennies for groceries, refusing to touch a cent of her settlement because she wanted her future to be her own. A ripple moved through the room as another piece of art was brought forward for bidding. The auctioneer's voice rose, calling for numbers, the rhythm of wealth resuming. Eleanor didn't raise her hand this time. She didn't need to. Her earlier move had been enough to unsettle the hierarchy, to shift the invisible scales in her direction. Tonight wasn't about flaunting. It was about timing. That she let the room breathe, let Preston's tension grow with every passing minute. Bianca leaned toward him again, whispering, her jeweled fingers gripping his arm. Eleanor caught the flicker in Preston's eyes, the look of a man who realized that history had not buried his past as neatly as he had hoped. For all his power, all his control, here she was, uninvited in spirit but undeniable in presence. And she hadn't even spoken a word. She thought back to a conversation with her oldest friend, years earlier, when she had first whispered her idea for rebuilding her life. "They think you're done," her friend had said. "Let them think it. Surprise is stronger than sympathy." Those words had stayed with her, carved into her memory like scripture. Tonight, as she sat among the same people who once pitied her, she felt the truth of it. Surprise was not just stronger. It was everything. The lights dimmed once more, signaling the next segment of the gala. A performance, a speech, another round of clinking glasses and rehearsed applause. But Eleanor barely heard it. She was too focused on the way the night was unfolding, too aware of how close she was to the moment she had been waiting for. Not yet, but soon. For now, she sat perfectly still, letting anticipation grow around her like a storm cloud gathering before the first crack of thunder. She knew the crowd. They would speculate, they would whisper, they would lean closer to one another trying to guess. Was she here to cause a scene? To beg for attention? To remind Preston of the life he left behind? None of those answers would satisfy them, and that was her advantage. The real story was bigger than anything they could imagine. She swirled the champagne in her glass, the golden bubbles catching the light. A faint smile tugged at her lips. She had waited years for this, and she wasn't here to be remembered as someone's ex-wife. She was here to be seen, finally, as herself. And though the night was still young, she knew this much. By the time dawn touched the city, the story whispered in every corner of this glittering room would not be about Preston, or Bianca, or any of the painted canvases they had bid on. It would be about Eleanor Grace, about the woman who walked back into a room designed to forget her and reminded them all that she was never truly gone. Asterisk. The orchestra swelled again, violins trembling with the kind of beauty that could soften even the sharpest whispers. But the music could not mask what was happening in the room. The attention of the gala, once scattered like pearls across the crowd, had begun to gather in one place. People pretended to watch the stage, to nod politely at the performers. Yet their eyes slid toward her again and again, as if drawn by a magnet. Eleanor Grace had not spoken, had not announced, had not asked for notice. And yet, she was the only thing they could not stop noticing. The moment came with the second auction round. The item was not a painting or a sculpture, but a rare foundation endowment, an opportunity to fund a scholarship in the name of the highest donor. It was not glamorous, not the kind of prize people fought over, but it carried weight, legacy, permanence. And it was here that Eleanor knew the ground beneath the gala would shift. The auctioneer's voice carried through the room, warm and practiced. The bids began modestly, each voice measured. A politician raised his paddle, an heiress followed. The numbers climbed, but sluggishly, without passion. It was a contest no one cared to win until Eleanor raised her hand. The figure she spoke was not outrageous. It was precise, deliberate, just enough to command silence. The room stilled. People turned toward her again, the air suddenly thick with realization. This was not a woman casually playing a game of wealth. This was someone who chose her moment with surgical accuracy. A man at the far table raised his paddle, trying to reclaim the flow of the evening. She responded calmly, her voice unshaken as she raised the number higher. Another bid, another response. With each exchange, she revealed not just her ability to play, but her refusal to lose. The rhythm quickened, the crowd leaning closer as if watching a duel. But where her opponents grew louder, their gestures sharper, Eleanor remained steady, unhurried, her gaze never wavering. The final number landed like a stone dropped into still water. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack, sealing the victory. The scholarship, the legacy, the name etched in history, it was hers, and in that instant, the whispers turned into a hum of awe. Because the name that would now be engraved on that prestigious endowment was not Hale, not Preston, not Bianca. It was hers alone, Eleanor Grace. Preston's smile faltered again, the cracks in his composure now undeniable. He lifted his glass too quickly, the movement just sharp enough for those watching closely to see. Bianca whispered something in his ear, but his eyes stayed fixed on Eleanor. It was the look of a man who understood that the past he had tried to bury was standing tall. Not in the shadows, but in the brightest light of the evening. Eleanor's pulse was steady, her breath calm. She had not come for revenge, and yet the satisfaction of the moment was undeniable. Every sneer, every whisper of pity, every time she had been written off as a relic of someone else's life, it all crumbled. In this single act, the crowd did not look at her as a forgotten wife anymore. They looked at her as a force, someone who could not be erased. But what struck her most was not their awe. It was the faint glimmer of something deeper: respect. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of their regard shift. Not pity, not scandal, respect. The rest of the evening unfolded around her, but the energy in the room had changed. Conversations now circled back to her, cautious and curious. When did she return? What has she been doing all this time? Where did this strength come from? They asked the questions in hushed tones, too wary to approach her directly, too fascinated to let the matter drop. Eleanor let them wonder, let the suspense curl tighter around their curiosity. She did not rush to fill the silence with explanations. Mystery was a currency, and tonight she had more of it than anyone else. At one point, as she rose from her table to stretch her legs, the sea of guests parted instinctively. Strangers greeted her with polite nods, their voices careful, their words chosen with sudden respect. It was as if the act of placing her name on that endowment had rewritten her story in their minds. She was no longer the woman abandoned. She was the woman who had returned, carrying a story greater than the one they thought they knew. She paused near a towering display of roses, letting the fragrance wrap around her. For a fleeting moment, her thoughts slipped backward, to the nights when she had been nothing but exhaustion and determination. When she had told herself, hold on, this will mean something someday. And now it did. Yet this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The room believed she had revealed her strength. They didn't realize that what they had seen tonight was just the surface. The empire she had built in silence still waited beneath, vast and unshakable. And when the time came to reveal it, their shock tonight would seem like nothing in comparison. As she turned back toward the crowd, she caught Preston watching her again, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes locked. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. He had tried to erase her. Instead, she had rewritten herself. The orchestra shifted into another song, its melody bright and triumphant. Eleanor moved back to her table, her steps unhurried, her presence undeniable. Around her, the whispers followed, louder now, no longer hidden. They wanted to know her story. They wanted to understand how she had done it. They wanted to believe that such a return was possible, and that was the beauty of it. Because Eleanor had not only claimed her place, she had lit a spark in the hearts of those who saw her. She was proof that loss was not the end, that being underestimated was not a curse but a weapon, that a life rewritten could shine brighter than the one that came before. The night pressed on, glittering and grand, but the truth was simple. It no longer belonged to Preston, or to Bianca, or to the Gala itself. The night belonged to her. And as she lifted her glass once more, letting the light catch its rim, Eleanor Grace smiled, not for the crowd, not for Preston, but for herself. Because for the first time in years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Gala glimmered on, but the current in the air had changed course. The stage, the speeches, the clinking of glasses, all of it seemed like background music now. Mere decoration to the real story unfolding in quiet glances and half-finished whispers. Wherever Eleanor moved, the air bent toward her. People who had once looked through her now found themselves craning their necks, their conversations circling back to her name, their questions tangled with disbelief. Preston tried to reclaim the spotlight. He laughed louder, gestured bigger, spoke to anyone who would listen. But it was like throwing stones into the ocean no matter how much noise he made. The tide had already turned. Bianca smiled brilliantly at his side, but even her radiance dimmed beneath the growing fascination directed elsewhere. Eleanor could feel it, a wave swelling, gathering strength, ready to crest. The moment came unexpectedly, not from her, but from the host who stepped to the microphone. He was an older man, silver hair catching the light, his voice rich with practiced charm. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not only art, but the spirit of resilience and contribution. Our foundation thrives because of those who believe in creating legacies greater than themselves. And it is my honor to recognize a donor whose influence, though quiet, has already reshaped opportunities for countless lives." The crowd leaned forward, curious. Recognition was a prized currency in this room, often reserved for those whose names dominated newspapers or adorned buildings. But the name that left his lips was one no one expected: Eleanor Grace. The room froze. For a heartbeat, even the orchestra hesitated, the bowstrings catching on silence. Then applause erupted, uncertain at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Eleanor rose slowly, her movements unhurried, her expression composed. She did not rush to bask in it, did not wave theatrically. She simply stood, and in her stillness commanded more attention than any grand gesture could. The host continued, his voice warm. "For years, Ms. Grace has been an unseen benefactor in several of our most ambitious projects. Tonight we acknowledge her not as a guest, but as a cornerstone of this foundation's progress." Whispers crackled like sparks. Unseen benefactor? Projects for years? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. People turned to one another, their surprise too great to contain. They thought she had been surviving, quietly existing at the edge of relevance. Instead, here she was, revealed as a force who had been shaping their world without them even knowing. Preston's face was a mask, stiff with disbelief. Bianca leaned toward him, lips moving in a question he did not answer. His eyes, fixed on Eleanor, betrayed the storm inside him. Eleanor inclined her head politely, accepting the recognition, then sat back down. That was all. No speech, no flourish, but restraint was its own weapon. She let the applause fade, let the room sit with the revelation, let them fill the silence with their own speculation. Around her, she could feel the shift. Strangers approached with tentative smiles, eager to align themselves with her without knowing exactly how. Investors murmured her name as though testing its weight on their tongues. Even the waitstaff carried her glass with more care, sensing what the guests had only begun to understand. This woman was not here to be remembered as a past, but to be recognized as a present. She let her thoughts drift back to the nights when her world had felt unbearably small. A quiet apartment, a single desk lamp, the sound of her pen scratching across endless notes. She had poured herself into work that no one saw, into building something that had no audience. And now, here was the reward, not the applause itself, but the knowledge that her years of being invisible had given her the power to reappear, not as a shadow, but as a storm. The evening carried on, but the narrative had shifted. People no longer whispered about Preston's new marriage or his latest acquisitions. They whispered about her, about what she had built, about how she had hidden it so well, about what else she might be hiding still, later. As she stood near the edge of the ballroom, a man approached, an investor she recognized, one who had dismissed her years ago at a dinner when she had dared to share an idea. He cleared his throat, his smile careful, respectful. "Ms. Grace," he said, "if I may your work with the foundation, it's remarkable." "I had no idea." Eleanor met his gaze calmly, her voice soft but certain. "Few people did." That was the point. The answer disarmed him, left him blinking, as though he had expected her to gush with gratitude or explain herself away. But she had no need for either. He stammered a polite farewell and drifted off, leaving her smile lingering faintly, as cool as the crystal glass in her hand. The truth was beginning to seep through the cracks of the evening, and Eleanor knew that once truth began to seep, it could not be contained. By tomorrow morning, her name would be on every tongue, every headline, not as Preston's ex-wife, not as a relic of the past, but as the woman who had risen quietly and revealed herself brilliantly. Or still, she was not finished. Tonight was not about a single recognition or a scholarship bid. Tonight was the unveiling of the first layer. The empire she had built remained cloaked, vast and waiting. What they had seen was only the beginning, the smallest fraction of what she had become. She lifted her glass once more, the bubbles rising like sparks of memory, and thought to herself, "They wanted me to disappear. Instead, I learned how to rise." And as the gala pressed on, the city outside glittering with 1,000 unseen lights, Eleanor Grace sat in the center of it all, knowing the night had already shifted history. The crowd thought they were watching her return. They didn't yet realize they were witnessing the start of her reign. The city had long since surrendered to nightfall, but inside the gala hall the lights still burned bright, and so did the conversations that swirled like smoke around Eleanor's name. What had started as whispers had grown into speculation, and what had grown into speculation now threatened to become obsession. She felt it in the way eyes followed her, in the way laughter dimmed as she passed, in the way strangers stumbled over themselves to offer her champagne or a compliment they hoped might tie them to her rising star. But she remained calm, deliberate, patient, because this was not the peak, not yet. Tonight wasn't about a single burst of recognition. Tonight was about planting a truth so undeniable that it would echo long after the chandeliers dimmed and the polished floors emptied. When the second round of speeches began, Eleanor excused herself from the table and moved toward the stage. No one had asked her to. No announcement was scheduled. But she walked with such unshakable certainty that the event's host, sensing a tide he could not stop, simply stepped back and yielded the microphone. The crowd hushed, forks stilled against porcelain. Even Preston, mid-conversation, froze and turned to face her, his expression caught between disbelief and dread. Eleanor stood there, tall beneath the glow of 1,000 lights, and allowed the silence to stretch. She did not rush to fill it. She let them lean forward, let them wait, let the anticipation thicken until the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that silenced even the restless whispers in the back. "Most of you believed my story was over. You saw a woman discarded, diminished, erased, and I let you believe it. Because invisibility, though painful, can be powerful. It gives you the freedom to build without scrutiny, to rise without interruption, to create without sabotage." The words landed like sparks on dry grass. The audience leaned closer, drawn in. Eleanor's eyes swept the room, meeting faces both familiar and dismissive, faces that had once pitied her or ignored her altogether. "I did not spend these years mourning what was taken," she continued. "I spent them creating something greater than what was lost. Tonight, you've glimpsed the beginning. My work with the foundation is only one thread in a much larger fabric." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The tension deepened. Even those who wanted to look away could in single quotes. Eleanor pressed on. While Preston Carmichael expanded his empire in glass towers and corporate takeovers, I was building my own, not to compete with him, but to outgrow the very game he plays. Investments in renewable energy, medical innovations, educational initiatives. You have not seen my name attached to them, but you have seen their impact. And starting tonight, that changes. The host blinked, stunned. As her words pierced the air with clarity, she reached into her clutch and withdrew a sleek, silver drive. Holding it up so it caught the light, she said. On this, you'll find proof. Financial records, partnerships, blueprints for the projects already in motion. I built this quietly, patiently, while you all assumed I had disappeared. I am not here to reclaim a title or to challenge one man's empire. I am here to introduce you to a new one. A collective murmur broke through the hall, voices clashing, disbelief sparking into awe. Some looked at her with wide eyes, others with wary calculation. Preston's jaw tightened, but his silence betrayed him. Bianca reached for his arm, whispering, but he couldn't look away from Eleanor. She lowered the drive into her clutch once more and let her gaze travel slowly across the room. Power, she said softly, is not taken. It is revealed. Tonight, I reveal mine. Applause erupted, not polite, not obligatory, but fierce and thunderous, like a wave crashing against stone. People stood, some out of admiration, others because they sensed history tilting before their very eyes. Investors whispered frantically, already calculating what alignment with her might mean. Reporters scribbled notes, their headlines writing themselves. For the first time all night, Eleanor allowed herself a true smile. Not one of politeness or restraint, but of quiet triumph. She had not needed to humiliate anyone, had not needed to shout her worth. She had simply shown them who she had become, and that was enough to unravel everything they thought they knew. Preston remained seated, his face pale beneath the golden lights. In that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that his era of dominance had begun to fade, not because of scandal or collapse, but because a brighter force had stepped into view, a force he could no longer dismiss, no matter how hard he tried. As the applause thundered on, Eleanor stepped away from the microphone. She did not linger in the glow of attention. She walked back through the crowd, each step measured, each movement a reminder that she did not need their validation. She already carried her victory within her. When she reached her table, a young woman intercepted her, eyes shining. "You've given me hope," she whispered, her voice trembling with sincerity. Eleanor paused, touched her hand gently, and replied, "Then carry that hope forward. Build with it. That is how change begins." The orchestra resumed, the evening pressing on, but nothing was the same. Conversations shifted, alliances reformed, futures rewrote themselves in real time. Eleanor had not just reclaimed her place, she had redefined it, planting herself firmly in a world that had once overlooked her. As she raised her glass one final time that night, she thought back to the woman she had been, the one who signed her divorce papers with a trembling hand, who had walked away into uncertainty. That woman was gone. What stood in her place was someone the world would not only see, but never forget. And as the chandeliers glittered above her and the crowd pulsed with restless admiration, Eleanor Grace knew this was not the end of her story. It was the prologue. The real chapters, the empire, the impact, the change were only just beginning.